Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. I am so glad that you're here with us. I'm Dr. Thema, licensed psychologist, professor, and researcher at Pepperdine University, and so excited for this next installment in our series. I am grateful to have with us on today Dr. Donell Barnett, and I want to give him an introduction so you would know who he is and what he is contributing to our field and to our larger society because it is so significant. And I want to take this moment just before the introduction to thank you, all of you who are joining us live and those who will watch the replay with everything that we have on our plates, pandemic included. It means a lot that you have taken time for what I like to call sacred pause to join us in this conversation. And so let me tell you about our guest for today. Dr. Donell Barnett is a counseling psychologist with a personal mission of improving communities. Some of his previous work include director of HIV prevention programs, adjunct professor of psychology, behavioral health clinic director, and chief of field investigations and program evaluation for the U.S. Army Public Health Center. He now serves as the Deputy Director for Mental Health Clinical Operations at the Illinois Department of Human Services. His expertise and interests, like mine, include trauma, the role of faith, and programs to improve the health and well-being of communities left out of economic and social growth. I want to also name that he's the proud recipient of several awards, with the most prestigious being the U.S. Army Bronze Star, Meritorious Service Medal, and the President's Award from the Association of Black Psychologists. Dr. Barnett has the esteemed honor of serving as the 2019 to 2021 President-elect of the Association of Black Psychologists. And in October, his official presidency will begin. Along with his wife and son, the Barnett family calls Chicago Southside their home. And we know some other great leaders from the South Side. So we are so glad that you're here. Welcome, and thank you for being with me on today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am overjoyed to be with you today.
Oh, I appreciate it. And today is a special day for those of us who are members of the American Psychological Association because voting starts on today. And we want to encourage everyone to cast their ballots and to know that less than 10% of members usually vote. And so we know from our communities as people of African descent, the power of our political mobilization and how that affects our mental health and our holistic well-being. And so that is a conversation we want to have today as we think about the mental health of Black Americans, of people of African descent. Whether we think about African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, those across the diaspora, and looking at how we have been affected during these times. And so as psychologists that are committed to wellness and to justice, I'm excited for this conversation. So Dr. Donell, we have a shared interest in trauma and in underserved communities and disenfranchised communities. So I want to ask first, in terms of your observations, how have you seen the stress of this season affecting the Black community, recognizing it is diverse, but within the Black community, what effects are you seeing?
For sure. Thank you so much again for the question and for the opportunity to be in conversation. It has, we've seen sort of two different tiers happening with folks these days, just on a personal level, basic needs, food, shelter, employment, just sort of the overall massive strain on basic needs and basic resources. People are thinking about their children and really concerned about their education, their future, what all has gone on with school systems, some being shut down, some remote, just all kind of things going on with their kids as a source of stress for Black communities in particular. Fighting with employers, right? For those who have jobs, right?
Yeah.
Fighting with employers around how to do life these days and make, ends meet.
Mhm.
You're sort of having to do that with employers and do this dance. One of the things that sort of come out, and there's been a lot of discussion about, is Black folks making up a disproportionate amount of the essential worker
Yeah.
workforce, right? And so all the things that would entail, negotiating schedules, negotiating childcare, and all those sorts of pieces.
Mm.
um, People are reflecting on the just the amount of lives lost.
Yeah.
Grandmothers, aunties, uncles, church members,
Mhm.
teachers, right? People are reflecting on all of that and seeing a lot of loss around them, and it is, has sort of a primary trauma effect, but
Mhm.
it's a recurring trauma when you think about those family members or community members who were your babysitting support, or who were,
Mhm.
someone who could run errands with you, and you no longer have that resource. And as you're trying to think about how to plug those gaps in your lives, it keeps those lives lost as a fresh re-traumatization, right? So over and
Mhm.
over. The inability to connect with family and friends.
Yeah.
We all have probably done a Thanksgiving Zoom, or
Right.
or something like that, right? And it's good, in a pinch, but I don't
Mhm.
think we've gotten to the point where it's the same as wrapping your arms around
Mm.
your mom's neck, right?
Yeah.
So all of these sort of things are ways that we're hearing and that we've seen are affecting really everybody, but Black folks in particular,
Mhm.
on a personal level.
Right.
Then you sort of take that and superimpose that on, the larger structural racism, systemic kinds of
Mhm.
things that's going on as well. And so it's operating on both of those levels, and folks are finding ways to, just kind of get one foot in front of the other,
Mhm.
without, a sense of where the support or help is going to come from, and just kind of make it from day to day.
Right. I appreciate you giving us that framework and laying it out, because it is both very personal and individual and looking at the family. And then, as you just mentioned, the systemic and structural issues as well. As you were naming, we've been disproportionately affected when we think at death and loss,
Hmm.
and oftentimes not even being able to gather for funeral services.
Right.
And so people lacking that sense of support or closure or spiritual connection, or trying to do it virtually. And then that sense of community, that
Hmm.
by and large, we are a collectivistic culture. And so, what it has meant for a lot of people to feel that isolation,
Hmm.
but also that awareness, that deepening awareness of how much we value each other, right? And appreciate each other and appreciate connection. And in my practice, I've seen a number of the effects that you're mentioning, from people's depression, frustration,
Hmm.
anger, anxiety, increased dependence on substances, or coping with food, or coping with shopping.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the loneliness, right, for people who have been alone for long periods of time, or having to grieve missed opportunities, right? And so there has been so much pandemic wise. But then I want to highlight what you said about racism,
Yes.
right? That racism didn't take a break during the pandemic,
No.
right? And I said to someone recently, you would think they saw we're already dying, like leave them alone. But no, it's like in the midst of COVID-19, the increase in people joining hate groups and the
Hmm.
increase in hate crimes. And so the realities of economic disparities, health disparities, and the psychological and physical warfare of racism has really created a fatigue for some people, a sense of hopelessness, and then for some people, shifting into denial. When you hear
Hmm.
people say,
Hmm.
"I'm over it," right? Like
Hmm.
they are
Hmm.
acting like the pandemic is done, because they're just frustrated and overwhelmed. And so for psychologists who are listening, who may be working with Black Americans, and I want to say we have been going to therapy more. I think people are so frustrated that those who never went in the past were suddenly like, I need to get some sessions. And I will say
Hmm.
telehealth has helped because it removes some of the barriers of transportation and time that people can go online. But for psychologists who are listening, who are used to kind of using these cookie cutter models and not actually attending to culture or to oppression, can you talk some about the harm that can be created when psychologists or other mental health professionals don't attend to cultural contexts?
Yeah, that's a really really important insight. Psychology, like healthcare more broadly, and then like other things in society are largely rooted in a Eurocentric perspective, and to put a finer point on a rooted in a white male perspective. And that's not altogether bad when those who are doing the interventions
Mhm.
are doing it with people who have some cultural alignment with. But when you start to extrapolate that to everyone else who may not necessarily come from that worldview, then it can be very, very dangerous. And so, one practical way of thinking about it is, oftentimes therapy will have some sort of goal or objective, um but whatever that end state is, whether it is some achievement oriented thing or whatever the case may be, um uh, you know the person in front of you may not necessarily have that objective in mind, and that may not be the thing that they feel is healing or restorative or the point of therapy. So then you sort of get into this thing of where they are not treatment compliant, or they aren't making progress towards the goal, right? That sort of evaluative component that happens in therapy. And so that is one of the consequences of that happens from not attending to unique culture. I came of age during the multicultural counseling movement, and reading about Bill Cross and Helms, and folks who were talking about different cultures and developmental processes and things like that during that time. And multicultural, at least for me at that time as a grad student, it was really great to sort of hear that there are different perspectives out there. But I don't think the field has gotten to the point where we have had a wholesale reevaluation of the fact that what we consider therapy today really is rooted in a perspective.
Mhm.
And so now there's a little more attention to that, but we haven't quite made the bridge yet.
Mhm.
And so for the everyday client, consumer, whatever word you want to use, who's coming into therapy, the potential for risk and harm is still there, because of a lack of appreciation that worldviews are different, goals and objectives of therapy are different, and the way we as a field attend to those kinds of things can really can really make things worse. You know, it,
Yes.
yeah, so it's just a really important part of what's happening in our field, and sort of as we move and being very intentional about
Mhm.
that misalignment.
Yeah, thank you so much for naming that. I went to a recent training on Chicano affirmative therapy,
Hmm.
and they were saying, Western psychology can be hazardous to the mental health of the Latinx community, right? That when we are not attending to the person who is sitting there, the family that is sitting there, and that we all come with this socio-historical, socio-political uh, identity, right? That
Hmm.
as I'm
Hmm.
sitting here, I am one, but I am many, right?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
if people
Hmm.
don't see that, they can not only have ineffective interventions, but actually harmful interventions. And I'm glad you named that piece about how then when people don't grab hold of the intervention, they can be labeled or dismissed. And so one of the reminders I'd like to give to our graduate students is to not be so quick to label people, quote unquote, resistant to care.
Yes.
Right, or that they're not invested, that maybe it's not about their resistance or their lack of investment, but perhaps what we're doing is boring. Perhaps what we did wasn't worth the two bus rides, and I had to find childcare to get there. And what did we do? What did we do? It
Right.
wasn't worth it. And so, really reimagining our interventions and our frameworks. And while there has been a lot of attention to culturally modified interventions, which I think are important, and there's been some empirical support for these cultural modifications, I think it's also important to know that there are models and interventions that come from communities themselves, that emerge from the culture, and that is culture. And so, with that in mind, can you tell our viewers about African centered psychology? What is that, and any of some of the major principles?
Yeah, and I'll get there. But one other comment on the last topic is there's also danger and harm when there is a failure to appreciate the baseline level of racism that exists.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, racism sort of has this multiplication factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it is, marital problems, education problems, whatever the case, whatever the presenting issue is,
Yeah.
that undercurrent of living in a toxic racist society
Mm-hmm.
multiplies that problem that much more for some folks, and for other folks it privileges them or makes their problems less severe. And so and without sort of understanding that baseline level that's happening for all of us,
Mm-hmm.
it can also contribute to harm done in a therapy space.
Yes. And then just before you answer, I want to tag on to that. I was so appreciative that a number of direct resources for Black people around seeking therapy have recommended that they interview the therapist. And when you go and meet with a psychologist, ask them, what is your understanding of the mental health effects of racism? Like,
Mhm.
they should be able to have that conversation with you. So I'm glad you're naming that.
Yeah, no, that's really important. I'm glad to hear that recommendation. And I think it's a to your question about African centered psychology, which is it's a really exciting field, as you've mentioned. There are conversations happening that are coming to the fore now, but really have been around for a long time, around a more authentic psychology rooted in the worldview and perspective of different cultures.
Mhm.
And so, African centered psychology sort of has, thinking about a formal definition as being the unifying African principles, values, traditions that you would find in the broader Pan African community, and resting on those to explain, to intervene, to understand present day conditions, problems for Black folks throughout the diaspora. So not just in America, but throughout the world. It centers psychology on an African reality, an African epistemology based in an African worldview. It is intimately human centered,
Mhm.
and that is it esteems culture and the qualitative experience of people, sort of
Mhm.
understanding the person in context and in relation to the context that they're in. Some of the other things that sort of comes out of this body of knowledge is that it's not limited to naturally observed phenomena, and
Mhm.
so there the if I could use the phrase, the essence of things unseen, right?
Yes.
It is a part of it, that there are things happening in the world that are not easily observable,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of a bedrock tenet of more traditional, or I shouldn't say traditional, a more Western
Mm-hmm.
psychology. So, like its cousins in Africana studies and African literature and other disciplines rooted in an African context, African centered psychology draws a through line from early ancient African civilization to the present day lived experience of people of African descent throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the sort of the features and highlights of African centered psychology, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot, and
Yes.
you can tell I get excited about it, but it's not new. It's not new work.
Mm-hmm.
It's newer to some folks, and a lot of people are getting used to it, but uh, it's been around for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
longer than the word psychology.
Yes.
Folks of African descent were thinking about people and understanding people in relation
Mm-hmm.
to the context in the world.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking to that. And so much of Western psychology, European psychology can really be thought of as a baby science. But when we look at the elders of who has been culturally doing this work, and even understanding that talking and relationship are not something outside of us, right? But it
Mhm,
is
mhm,
really a part of our healing and wellness. And two of the groups that I really love from the Association of Black Psychologists are the Emotion Emancipation Circles and the Sawubona Healing Circles. And Sawubona is a Zulu greeting that means I see you. And so when we have this past year in the pandemic been doing these healing circles, utilizing not only the narrative, right, us telling our stories, and those from a Black church tradition would think about testifying,
mhm, mhm,
and then in our Latino community, we talk about testimonios, right, that there is power in the storytelling, and so us honoring our humanity, us honoring our dignity, honoring our interconnectedness, right? That
mhm, mhm,
I am because we are, right? So my identity is based in our relationships. And, when I think about a number of the models and interventions, including into psychotherapy and
mhm, mhm,
the utilization of Kwanzaa principles as people are looking to heal. So for those, who are not familiar, the holiday between December 26th and January 1st, some of those principles are Imani, faith. And so talking to
mhm.
people about their faith, talking to people about creativity, talking to people about self-determination. And so going through these principles
Purpose.
as we, are looking to heal and to be holistic. So many of these Western models, the models that we are traditionally taught in our psychology programs, ignore spirituality.
Mhm,
And there's interesting research from one of my wonderful supporters in my department at Shafransky, did research and found that overall mental health professionals endorse lower rates of religiosity than the general public. So what does it mean for people without faith to be constructing the healing framework for people who are largely people of faith or spirituality? So I wonder if you could speak some to how psychologists can appropriately, ethically attend to the spirituality of their clients as we think about African-centered psychology.
Yeah, that's a great point, and sort of tying in what we were just talking about in African centered psychology. One of the other features is that it was a very active, intentional, and deliberate push against a deficit based psychology, right?
Mm-hmm.
That largely, by and large, looked at Black folks and communities of color from a deficit model. What's wrong with them? African Center Psychology has actively brought forward strengths, traditions and values that were sustaining, that were medicine, that were healing, that were keeping. And so, one of those is the notion of spirit, and really sort of elevating that spirituality is an integral part of not just the Black experience, but many cultures around the world and throughout history. And so I think your point about a group of folks who largely don't operate from a spiritual frame, designing interventions for a world population who are largely rooted in a spiritual frame is very, that it's a very timely, poignant observation. And for whatever reason, white psychology has never really got that, and still doesn't. But psychology rooted in an African context recognizes that spirit guides, that spirit moves, that it shapes things. It connects us with our ancestors and with our descendants. It connects you and me, even though
Mhm.
this is the first time we've had been in conversation like this.
Yes.
So we African psychology appreciates that spirit permeates everything,
Mhm.
and it's a part of a collective understanding, a collective knowing, that spirit creates those connections. um, and I always find it interesting when we talk about spirit, because I grew up, and I think a lot of us who trained in sort of traditional ways were probably taught to dismiss this stuff out of
Mhm.
hand, and that's because of Western training based in a
Mhm.
Western worldview. Didn't really have an appreciation for what it couldn't understand.
Mhm.
But that's sort of a major principle of behaviorism, right? And the
Mhm.
force that behaviorism has had on the field of saying that, if we can't see it and observe it, then it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
But cultures around the world, and particularly, not particularly, but African cultures, have really attended to this. And so you were also asking about how do you incorporate it. You see it in interventions by actively inviting ancestors to offer guidance in a therapy context, or to assist with discerning what the root of a problem is and what the solution may be. That's one way that you might see spirituality used in a therapy context. You may see it in practices that center meditation, and centers deep thought and reflection, so such that someone would be invited to move beyond the thoughts that's kind of screaming at them,
Mhm.
quiet that down, and
Mm.
allow a deeper wisdom to come forward, to really sort of help people understand a path forward in their lives that they might not have come to by themselves, with sort of that surface cognitive thinking, but something that was really guided by your ancestors. There are things in you that that you don't know that until you allow those things to come forward. And we believe that our ancestors have handed things down to us through our lineage, through our line. And so spirit allows a fuller conversation about these kinds of topics, which are really resonates with a lot of minority community, or not minority, and a lot of ethnic communities, but isn't necessarily a part of a Western frame of how to
Mhm.
do this work.
Yes. Thank you so much for those examples. And, I think for clinicians, practitioners, really starting at the phase of assessment, if we say this is the time for me to get to know who I'm
Mhm.
meeting with, and you've been working with someone for months, some people years, and have never asked them about their faith, their spirituality, or their religion. And that may be a major part of how they're coping, how they're
Mm-hmm.
making meaning in the world, how they are understanding even their condition. And so it's important to ask the questions. And as you make reference to ask it without judgment. That if you have been so indoctrinated to believe that that is only something harmful or for people who are ignorant, that in itself is racist,
Yeah.
right? To believe that people of faith are somehow people who are ignorant
And
is
enlightened.
problematic. Is highly problematic, and so to ask it with the openness and with a respect for people's traditions and with people's beliefs. And then one of the cautions that people often ask me to make when I'm talking on this topic is to also be careful around appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you are not from the culture of the person you're working with, to respectfully discuss it, explore it, even possibly integrate it, but not with this assumption that you are it,
Yeah,
right?
don't do that.
Don't do that. Don't do
Don't do
that. So that comes in with that cultural humility, and I love you speaking to us getting to what we know. In Swahili, the term kujua,
Mm-hmm.
to know,
Mm-hmm.
it also implies remembering that which I already know. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there is wisdom in us that stress, trauma, racism, sexism disconnects us from. And so to reclaim our wisdom is a part of our healing, our wholeness,
Yes.
our wellness. Another important tool that has been central in African-centered psychology is the expressive arts.
Mm-hmm.
And the healing circles that I was referencing, we'll use music and movement and proverbs, African proverbs and poetry. So can you talk some about the healing power of the expressive arts?
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting, transformative, moving work. Yeah, we've long known that artistic expression has had healing qualities. And that's been formalized, in many ways through dramatic expression in therapy, through written forms of expression, drawing, painting, and so forth. All of those have sort of found a place in mainstream psychology in many ways. But African culture and many other cultures have also had dance and drumming and community singing as a part of the rituals and traditions for centuries, if not longer. And and so you have to sort of think about what has preserved these practices over centuries.
Mhm.
And I think it's because they understood, and as we understand now, that these forms of artistic expression, they were a part of individual and collective wellness.
Mhm.
That there is something important in understanding my tradition, understanding culture, understanding what is normal, how we keep stories and connections alive. And this is sort of one aspect of doing that. And so, sort of drawing on that tradition, practitioners of African psychology incorporate dance and drumming in their work. And I note here for anyone who may need this clarification, we're not talking about the cha-cha slide and stuff like that, right? We're not talking about that kind of dance, but dance and art and drumming modeled on an African tradition. And part of the reason for doing that is it is a way of staying connected, of connecting us to our roots. And that connection is seen as a primary objective of intervention. As you mentioned, sort of drawing on proverbs, African proverbs, drawing on cultural practices, helping people to refamiliarize themselves with their origin, and make that familiarization a routine, everyday part of their lives, that is seen as a primary objective of doing this work from a healing standpoint. And so, I probably should also mention that, expressive arts is also connected to the question we were talking about spirituality. That
Mhm.
it's not it's often it is often the case where expressive arts leads to a sense of transcendence, of a, sort of a transcendent state, kind of getting lost in that moment. And that, is another bridge to this connection of spirituality, of sort of operating outside of yourself. And so, it's like really, really fascinating stuff that you don't talk about very often, but it's just an interesting note that these are things that have been happening in cultures for a very, very long time, because they knew, as we are discovering,
Mhm.
they knew it had healing qualities and properties, and very important to the survival of
Right.
folks.
Yes. And I'm so glad you named that in terms of the history, because, Western psychology, we're late to the party in terms of
Hmm.
trying to catch up. And so now there are all these, which I love, body-based interventions
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
systemic therapies, and recognizing that talk alone doesn't get there. When we talk about trauma, there's an impact on our bodies, and we've even an impact on our spirits. And so we can't leave them out of our healing process. And it's one of the things I appreciate about the annual conference for Association of Black Psychologists. As you go and you feel and experience spirit, drum, dance. And it's one of the things I really want to enliven and promote at APA, because if you say you are an organization for wellness and we go for convention and it feels sterile,
Hmm.
right? That it feels lifeless in some ways, then something is off between like what
Hmm.
we are speaking of and what we are living or embodying. And so the arts, and I love your connection with spirituality, because some have called it, and I also like to call it sacred arts, right? Not
Hmm.
only
Hmm.
expressive arts, but the sacred arts, that we reconnect or come alive. What are the things? Howard Thurman was a great African American theologian, said, do the things that make you come alive, because there are far too few of us that are actually alive. And
My.
I feel that. I feel that. So I want to ask, and I don't want to try to cite the person, because I've heard multiple people say it and I don't know who the source is,
Hmm.
but multiple people have talked about culture as medicine. Right?
Hmm.
Culture is medicine. And so I wonder if you could speak to how people of African descent learning about their culture, their heritage, their identity can be helpful for their mental health.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't have the right citation either, but I have heard it many, many, many times, and I have found it to be true.
Yeah.
Culture acts as a one of the things that culture does is it acts as a cleansing agent.
Mm,
Sort of, as we were talking about earlier, this baseline level of toxicity that exists around us in terms of racism, oppression, and so on and so forth. Culture reminds and affirms that I am beautiful. It
mm,
it it affirms that I have been fearfully and
mhm.
wonderfully made.
Yes.
Culture helps me to understand that I'm not a descendant of slaves, but I'm a
Mhm,
part of the legacy of a people who had been kidnapped and enslaved.
mhm. Yes.
But it also tells me that that's not where the story begins.
Yes,
That,
indeed.
way before that,
Yeah.
kings and queens who invented
Mhm,
math and science and
mm,
geography and
mhm,
architecture, right?
yeah.
That is a part of the legacy in which we sit in today.
Mhm,
And so reminding um, culture is medicine in partly in medicine. It's medicine in part
Mhm.
because it reminds people of who they are, of whose they are,
Mhm.
from where they've come, and on that premise, you can have a reframe, a rethinking about the challenges that are in front of you right
Mm.
now. What brought you into therapy? And it means something different when you might see yourself as someone where the world is acting against.
Mm.
It means it's a very different thing when you know that I'm a part of a legacy of people who acted on the world. And now I can sort of frame what's in front of me a little bit differently. So that deliberate and intentional grounding of culture is one of the chief tools
Mhm.
and protective factors.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for naming that because when we don't feel worthy, right, when we don't feel like we are enough, that becomes the root of so much. I'm
Hmm.
living with this sense of inadequacy and shame, and also what we would call internalized racism,
Hmm.
right? When I
Hmm.
have come to believe those lies that have been told about me and or forced to believe I am an exception,
Hmm.
right? That
Hmm.
even though I am from this problematic group, that somehow I'm special or different, that creates many, many distortions and
Hmm.
disconnections. And so for us to come home to ourselves, not only as individually, but collectively and culturally. And so I am so appreciative for what you have shared. And I know this has just been an appetizer. So I want to ask you about resources for people who want to learn more about African centered psychology or working with people of African descent. Any resources you can share?
Yeah, I can't believe the time has gone away. I've enjoyed this so much.
Yes, me
Uh,
too.
of course, people can visit absci.org, www.absci.org, where you'll learn more about some of our founders and scholars and elders who have published in many places, books and so forth. We have the Journal of Black Psychology, which is in a couple years we'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Journal of
Mm,
Black Psychology.
excellent.
And that's another resource where you'll find uh, theoretical pieces, research pieces, book reviews, and so forth, to sort of understand some of these concepts a little bit more and think and how to apply them in practice.
Mhm.
We're doing a lot of social media engagement on our Facebook page, YouTube, Instagram, all the things, all
Mhm.
the young folks who know all of that stuff. You can find us on any of those platforms where we have weekly chats and podcasts just to kind of get, your little bite-sized fix and digest it and come back the next week. And so, those are, some of the places where you can engage and learn more and start to sort of bring some of these things into your practice or consulting or, whatever you're teaching, whatever it is that you do. There's a place for it.
Wonderful. I'm so glad that you named that both the website and the journal. And I'm excited to say that two of the supporters of the campaign published an article with me recently for the journal looking at the Black model,
Mm.
BLAC,
Mhm.
and attending to the mental health of Black activists. And that's a whole
Oh, yeah.
another population of people who have put their lives, their bodies, their time, their energy on the line, trying to advocate for justice, the consequences of that, and also ways to refuel and to refill ourselves, which is so important. And so, thank you so much for your time and all the best on your presidency starting next month.
Madasi Pa, and congratulations to you. Wishing you much success.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. For those who are APA members, you should have received your ballots today. And you will have the next 6 weeks until October 28th to turn those in. But why wait till October when you could do it today? Thank you so much, and peace and blessings to all of you.
Blessings.